70 sevens are decreed for your people and your holy city to finish transgression, to put an end to sin, to atone for wickedness, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. Know and understand this. From the issuing of the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the anointed one, the ruler, comes, there will be 7 sevens and 62 sevens. It will be rebuilt with streets and a trench, but in times of trouble. After the 62 sevens, the anointed one will be cut off and will have nothing. The people of the ruler who will come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end will come like a flood. War will continue until the end, and desolations have been decreed. He will confirm a covenant with many for 1 7. In the middle of the 7, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering. And on a wing of the temple, he will set up an abomination that causes desolation, until the end that is decreed is poured out on him. Well, I want you to imagine that you are on a road trip across the United States of America. You're driving from east to west, and after a few hours of driving, you come to the Appalachian Mountains. You look out the window, and you are amazed at how high up you are, and you're amazed by the incredible views that you're able to see. But then you pull over, you get out your map, you want to see how much further you have to go, and as you look at your map, you realise there's good news and there's bad news. The bad news is you have got a very long way to go. In fact, you have got days and days of driving still to come. You are in this for the long haul. But there's good news. The good news is if you keep on driving, eventually you're going to get to the Rocky Mountains, and you will be way higher than you are now, and the views are going to be even more spectacular. Well, in one sense, that is what Gabriel is telling Daniel in these verses. Gabriel is pulling out God's roadmap. He's saying to Daniel, Daniel, this is where you are, but this is where we're going. And Gabriel is saying to Daniel, Daniel, it's going to be a long, hard road for God's people. And yet, on the other hand, Gabriel shows Daniel that the very thing he's been praying for, the Jews going back to Jerusalem, that's a bit like the Appalachians. It's a stop along the way, but it's not the final destination. Gabriel shows Daniel that God has got something even better in store. God has got spectacular mountain peaks, incredible, unimaginable grace for his people further down the road. And so we want to come and see God's roadmap this evening. And this roadmap, it's not just for Daniel, it's not just for the Jewish people, it's for us. Because we are God's covenant people. And the only difference between us and Daniel and the Jewish people is that we happen to have been born a few thousand miles further down the road. So let's come and look at God's roadmap, and I have got 2 headings this evening. The first one, get ready for the long haul. Get ready for the long haul. So as we've seen, Daniel realizes that God's people are going to be in Babylon for 70 years. He knows that those 70 years are almost up. He knows it's almost time to go back to the promised land. And then last week, we saw Gabriel come barging in with a message from God. And as we look at that message, we need to realize that Daniel has got the number 70 in his head. He's been thinking about this for quite some time. So what's the message? Well, we see it in verse 24. 70 sevens. Sometimes, by the way, that's translated as 70 weeks, but literally it's sevens. 70 sevens are decreed for your people and your holy city. And here is, I think, what Gabriel seems to be saying. Gabriel saying, listen, Daniel, you're busy thinking about what happens at the end of 70 years. Let me tell you about another period of 70. Let me tell you about 70 sevens. Now, of course, that raises a really big question, doesn't it? What does Daniel mean, or what does Gabriel mean by 70 sevens? Well, you'll maybe remember that the number 7 is often used in the Bible symbolically. It's often used to signify completeness. And the number 70 is like a round version of the number 7. So, for example, Jesus tells Peter, you should forgive your brother 70 times 7. What does Jesus mean by that? Well, he doesn't mean whenever your brother sins against you for the 491st time, you get to slam the door in his face. It's symbolic. And so, whenever Gabriel is talking about 70 sevens, he's basically saying when you reach the end of the road, when everything has taken place. So, having thought about that, let's have a closer look at the journey that God has set out on his roadmap. And I think really you can divide this journey into two main sections. We see the first section of the journey in verse 25. And the first section is made up of 7 sevens and 62 sevens. We then see the second section of the journey after that. And if your math is up to scratch, you'll know that 7 plus 62 is 69. And that leaves us then with one more 7. Now, we do need to bear in mind, these are symbolic numbers. And so just because the last part of the journey is only 1 7 long, that doesn't actually mean necessarily that it's shorter than the rest of the journey. In fact, what I think it means is it's the climactic part of the journey. It is the bit that all the other 69 weeks have been leading up to. And I think that's helpful for us to realise. It's helpful for us to realise that the big difference in this passage, it's not between the 7 sevens and the 62 sevens. It's between the 69 sevens and then the 1 7 that comes after that. So, what's actually going on in all these sevens? Well, we see that Daniel's prayer is going to be answered. In verse 25, we see that a decree is going to go out. That decree will allow the Jews to go back and to rebuild Jerusalem. Notice at the end of the verse, it will be rebuilt with streets and a trench. And I think, by the way, trench may well refer simply to a water supply. So in other words, the city is going to be rebuilt properly. But even though that's good news, even though that is the very thing that Daniel has been praying for, God tells Daniel, that doesn't mean you've reached your destination. And it certainly doesn't mean that all your problems have been solved. Notice the very end of verse 25. It will be rebuilt with streets and a trench, but in times of trouble. And as we've already seen in Daniel, even when the Jews go back to the promised land, there's going to be trouble. So for example, in chapter 8, we thought about Antiochus Epiphanes. Do you remember? The madman. And he absolutely tormented the Jews. He unleashed this almost unbearable barrage of persecution. We've also seen in chapter 2 and in chapter 7 that even before him, the Greeks invade. And even after him, the Romans invade. There is going to be all sorts of bloodshed. And it's really important that Daniel understands that. And it's really important that we understand that. Yes, it's good news that they're going back to Jerusalem. But going back to the city doesn't actually solve any of their root problems. And so God is telling his people here, don't settle for the Appalachians when the Rockies are still to come. Don't set your sights too low. Don't make having your own city or having your own country the height of your ambition. Or to put it another way, don't go looking for heaven on earth. And I think that's a lesson that all of us need to learn. We have a real tendency, don't we, to look for answers to all of our problems in the here and now. Oh, if we can just get out of lockdown, if I can just get back to seeing people again, if things could just go back to the way they were before. If I could just quit my job and start a new career doing something I actually want to do. If my boyfriend or girlfriend would just commit, if we could just settle down and start a family. If I could just lose that weight. If I could just get onto that course. If I could just pay off that credit card debt. If we could just get some marriage counselling. And yet, those things, they don't solve everything. These Jews, they were back in their city, they had streets, they had a water supply, they had everything they'd been dreaming of, and yet they still had plenty of problems. They didn't find heaven on earth. And that should warn us. Let me also say something to you. If maybe you've already found this to be the case, maybe your life simply hasn't worked out the way that you would have liked it to have worked out. Well, do you see how this focus on God's timetable, it gives us hope in the midst of our hurt? It shows us that even if you have missed out on some of the sights and some of the stops along the way, it doesn't mean you have to miss out on the glory of the destination. The destination is the most important bit. And yes, it's a mistake to look for heaven on earth. We're going to end up disappointed if we do that. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a heaven to be had. And in this passage, God challenges us to lift our sights higher. And by the way, don't think I'm just talking to the non-Christians here. If you're already a Christian, I think we all need to recognise that sometimes we need to lift our sights higher. You know, sometimes we get discouraged, don't we? We get discouraged because we don't conquer sin as quickly as we would like to. We don't advance in godliness as quickly as we would like. Our family members, they don't join us. They don't become Christians too. The church doesn't grow as fast as we would like to see it grow. And yet, surely one of the most basic applications of these verses is that even if the point on the road where we are right now isn't all we wish it was, it's still worth driving. Because God has got incredible, wonderful things in store. And so, we need to keep our seatbelts on. We need to get ready for the long haul. But the second thing I want us to see this evening, we need to keep looking to the destination. Keep looking to the destination. So we're driving across America. We're in the Appalachians, but there are mountains to come that are way more spectacular than what we see right now. And so the question is, what do we learn about these mountain peaks of God's grace in Daniel chapter 9? What is it that is so much better even than going back to the promised land? Well, I want you to notice who the central figure is when it comes to this final climactic 7. Verse 26. After the 62 sevens, the anointed one will be cut off and will have nothing. And just remember, the Hebrew word for anointed is where we get our word Messiah. And the Greek equivalent, the word that's used in the New Testament, is where we get our word Christ. And that surely gives us a pretty big hint about who's in view in this passage. Now, it's fair, I suppose, to say sometimes this word is used for people other than Jesus. For example, King David was God's anointed. But all of those various anointed ones that we see in the Old Testament, they're all like messiahs with a small m, and they're all pointing us forward to the Messiah with the big M. And so, whoever verse 25 is talking about, and that's perhaps less clear, there can be no doubt whatsoever that the anointed one, the one who appears in this final climactic 7 in verse 26, it has to be Jesus. It has to be. There's just nobody else it could possibly be. And surely as we look at the verse, it's not actually hard to see Jesus. The anointed one will be cut off and will have nothing. Now that word cut off, it's often used in the Old Testament, and when it's used, it often describes the death penalty, execution. And of course that's exactly what Jesus went through when he went to the cross. And we can certainly say that Jesus had nothing, can't we? What does Philippians chapter 2 tell us, for example? It tells us that he made himself nothing and he took the form of a servant. And so this anointed one in verse 26 is so clearly Jesus Christ himself. And what's Gabriel telling Daniel? He's saying, Daniel, you think that going back to the promised land is going to be great? You think that it's going to be an incredible demonstration of God's grace and God's mercy? Just you wait until I tell you about Jesus. This anointed one is going to blow your wildest dreams completely out of the water. And so Gabriel tells Daniel about the gigantic mountain peaks of Christ's grace. And here, at last, we have the Rocky Mountains. We have them in verse 24. And you could say that we've got 6 great mountain peaks. 3 of them describe how Jesus fixes massive problems. 3 of them describe great positive achievements that Jesus makes. The first 3, Jesus finishes transgression, he puts an end to sin, and he atones for wickedness. Now, God's people are prisoners in Babylon, but as Daniel realizes, that is not actually the root problem or the root cause of all of their problems. As Daniel realizes, and as we've seen in this prayer, the big problem is sin. And that is why Daniel has been praying with so much passion that God would forgive. And here's God saying, Daniel, the Messiah, the anointed one, is going to deal with sin and transgression and wickedness. Oh, it's such great news for Daniel, isn't it? And it's also such great news for us. Why is it that no matter how much we chase for heaven here on earth, we never reach it? It's because of sin. It's because sin has left this world broken and fallen, and here is God saying to us, Jesus is going to fix that. Maybe tonight you're all too aware of how destructive and corrosive sin can be. Maybe this evening you have got a guilty conscience, and you try and try and try and try to make up for whatever you've done. You try and try to scrub yourself clean, and you scrub so much that you leave yourself raw, and yet the stench is still there. Maybe some of you are trying to fight against sin. You long to be free of its pull and its power, and so you grit your teeth and you resolve to stand firm, and yet you let yourself down again and again. Yet there's good news, isn't there? Because Jesus has atoned for sin. He smashes the chains that lock us in, and one day he's going to come back and he's going to finish sin once and for all. And surely that must have taken Daniel's breath away. As well as dealing with sin, we're also told about 3 positive things that Jesus does. He brings in, first of all, everlasting righteousness. In other words, Jesus doesn't just, deal with our sin and then leave us to get on with it ourselves. As one preacher put it, Jesus doesn't just rescue us from drowning and then leave us bobbing around in the middle of the ocean. No, he gives us his own everlasting righteousness. He gives us a cleanness and a cleansing that can never be taken away. Second thing we see, in terms of these positive things that Christ's going to do, he seals up vision and prophecy. In other words, all those Old Testament visions and prophecies are pointing forward to Jesus. And once Jesus comes, he's going to have the last word. And once Jesus has spoken, and once his apostles have shared the message that he told them to share, there is no more need for new books of the Bible, or for new prophecies, or for new visions. That's why Hebrews starts the way it does. In the past, God spoke to our forefathers through the prophets at many times and in various ways. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son. That means not just what Hebrews says, but also what Daniel 9 says. It means that in here we have got everything we need for getting to our destination. Because in this book, we have all the signs that we could possibly need that point us to the Saviour. It's 2 things, 2 glorious, positive things Christ has done. The third thing that he does, he anoints the most holy. I think this is very apt, because we've been thinking about the Holy of Holies in our morning service. That place in the temple where God had his presence. Well, the Holy of Holies was pointing forward to Jesus, because Jesus is the real Holy of Holies. Colossians chapter 2 puts it like this: in Christ, all the fullness of the deity lives in bodily form. And that's incredible. The high priest, he was the only one who could go into the Holy of Holies. And even the high priest could only go in there once per year. But now Jesus Christ has come. Now we can go into God's presence anytime, any day, any place, he anoints the most holy. And that means we've got so much to be thankful for. Our hearts should soar within us as we think about this Messiah that God promised. And let me say to you this evening, if you're not trusting in Jesus, just look at these 6 things that he does in verse 24. And ask yourself, how can I ever manage any of these things myself? How can I ever deal with the problem of sin? How can I ever have a hope for the future? How can I ever come into the presence of the holy God himself? How can I ever clothe myself with righteousness that can't be undone by my sin? And the answer is, you can't. Because Jesus is the only way. And if we go by our roadmap rather than by God's roadmap, well, then it's going to end in disaster. We need to keep our eyes on the destination. Well, I suppose that then leaves us with one more big question. And the question is this: whereabouts are we on this roadmap in the year 2021? Well, we're in this final 7, this climactic part of history. But we don't need to stop there. We can go a little bit further. As long as we remember that the number 7 is symbolic, we can actually say that we are in the second half of this final 7. We've seen that in this final 7, Jesus comes for the first time. We've seen that he is cut off, but then notice what happens in verse 26. The people of the ruler who will come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. Now, that's something that Jesus explains for us in Matthew chapter 24. About 40 years after Jesus' death, the Romans come with an army. They unleash havoc upon Jerusalem, and whenever they come, they destroy the temple. And we see that in verse 27. He will put an end to sacrifice and offering. And, here we are, almost 2,000 years after that, and the temple has never been rebuilt at any point. Why? The big reason is that the Jews, by and large, rejected the Messiah. They turned their backs on God's anointed one. The one that God is speaking about in this passage. The one that all of those visions and all of those prophecies are pointing forward to. And what did the Jews say? They said, we don't want him. And so God poured out his judgment on this rebellious nation that had rebelled in the worst possible way. And one of the things that shows us is that on God's roadmap, there are 2 destinations, not just one. For everybody who embraces the Messiah, there's salvation. There's final deliverance from sin. There's joy in God's holy presence. There's everlasting righteousness. And even the most wonderful, the most incredible blessings that you have ever experienced in the here and now, they're like tiny little hills compared to the rocky mountains that we're going to get to experience when Jesus comes again. What an incredible destination. And yet, there's another destination. a destination for those who reject the Messiah. And that is awful, agonizing destruction. And so let me urge you, please, please come to this Messiah before it's too late. Because one of the things this passage tells us is we don't know when it's going to be too late. You know, this final period, the period in which we live, it's described as 1/7. Suppose it was described as, say, 100 sevens. Well, maybe then we could sit back and relax. But God's described it as 1/7. And surely part of the reason for that is he wants to keep us on our toes. Jesus could come back at any time. And even if Jesus doesn't come back tomorrow, or the next day, or even for another 100 years, none of us ever know when we are going to reach our final destination. And so the question I want to leave you with is this: what's at the end of the road that you are on? Is it blessing? Indescribable blessing? Or is it destruction? Absolutely unbearable destruction. Let's pray.